The clock house. Sophie was on her way to visit her aunt in the countryside. She had always loved staying at her aunt's house, but this time it was different. Her aunt had recently passed away and Sophie was going to help her cousin clean up the house and prepare it for sale. As she approached the house, she noticed that it looked even more eerie and abandoned than she remembered. The garden was overgrown and the paint on the walls was peeling. Sophie wondered how long it had been since anyone had been there. She pushed open the creaky gate and made her way up to the front door. As she stepped inside, she was hit by the musty smell of old books and furniture. She called out for her cousin, but there was no answer. Sophie decided to explore the house on her own. She went from room to room, dusting and sorting through old belongings. As she made her way to the top floor, she stumbled upon a room that she had never seen before. It was a small room with a single window and an old grandfather clock in the corner. The clock was ticking loudly and the pendulum swung back and forth. Sophie approached it and noticed that the clock face was different from any other she had seen. The numbers were arranged in a strange pattern, and the hands seemed to move faster than usual. Suddenly, the clock chimed loudly and the room began to shake. Sophie stumbled back and the door slammed shut behind her. She was trapped. As she looked around frantically for a way out, she noticed that the clock had stopped ticking. She approached it again and saw that the hands were spinning backwards. Suddenly, she was transported to a different time and place. Sophie found herself in a different room, in a different house, in a different century. She looked out the window and saw that the world outside had changed. She had gone back in time. Sophie knew she had to find a way back to her own time, but she didn't know how. She began to explore her new surroundings and discovered that the house she was in belonged to a wealthy family. She met the family members and tried to find a way to communicate with them, but they spoke a different language. Sophie tried to find clues that would lead her back to her own time. She found an old diary that belonged to one of the family members, and as she read it, she realized that the grandfather clock had been a gift from a mysterious traveler who had passed through their town. Sophie knew that the traveler was the key to her escape. She set out to find him and discovered that he was a time traveler who had created the clock as a way to travel through time. She begged him to help her return to her own time, and he agreed. As Sophie made her way back to the clock, she realized that the journey had changed her. She had learned so much about herself and the world around her, and she knew that she would never forget her time in the past. Sophie stepped back into the clock room and found that time had stopped. The clock was no longer ticking and the hands were frozen in place. Sophie knew that she had to wind the clock to make it work again, but she hesitated. She wasn't sure if she wanted to go back to her own time. Finally, she took a deep breath and wound the clock. The pendulum started to swing and the clock began to tick again. Sophie closed her eyes and felt herself being transported through time. When she opened her eyes, she was back in the present day. The clock was ticking normally again and the door to the room had opened. Sophie walked out of the room and found her cousin waiting for her downstairs. She told him all about her adventure and he couldn't believe it. But Sophie knew it was true. She had lived it. As they finished cleaning up the house, Sophie couldn't help but feel a sense of sadness. She knew that the house would soon be sold, and that her time there had come to an end. But she also knew that she had gained something much more valuable than anything she could take with her. She had gained a new perspective on life and the world around her. Years later, Sophie returned to the countryside to visit her aunt's old house. As she approached it, she saw that it had been restored to its former glory. The garden was lush and green, and the paint on the walls was fresh and new. But the one thing that hadn't changed was the grandfather clock in the small room at the top of the house. Sophie smiled as she looked at it, knowing that it held the key to her greatest adventure. From that day on, Sophie lived her life with a new sense of wonder and adventure. She knew that there was so much more to the world than what met the eye, and that anything was possible if you just believed in it. And every time she heard the ticking of a clock, she remembered the clock house and the journey that had changed her life forever.